Hi, everyone. My name is Carson Weitnauer, and I serve as the Executive Director for Uncommon Pursuit. And today we're talking about a heartbreaking topic. The question is, what does the church need to know about abuse? And to wake us up to the crisis we're facing here, let me share with you what the statistics look like in a local church. If we extrapolate the data from the CDC to a church of 500 members, it would mean that nearly 100 members of that church are survivors of sexual abuse. And unfortunately, far too many evangelical churches and institutions don't want to hear about this subject. Sometimes they discourage victims from going to the police. They can support the abuser, who's a trusted leader in the church, more than the abused. Too often, they can accept an apology as a sufficient resolution of the issue. And of course, this isn't every church, but these patterns are far too common. And all of this re-traumatizes a survivor. Instead of finding support to recover from the agony of abuse, they feel betrayed and abandoned by God's people. And in Matthew 18, we see that Jesus took a different approach. He said, "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to fall away, it would be better for him if a heavy millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depths of the sea." So I don't know how to make it any more plain as we get started today. The issue of sexual abuse is incredibly sad and incredibly urgent. And I'm really grateful to have Boz Tchividjian with us today. He's an attorney who represents abuse survivors. He's a man of incredible compassion and fearless resolve. And he's going to help us understand how we can do better. Boz personally represented me last year in my dispute with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. They were seeking to impose aggressive non-disclosure commitments upon me as part of my departure, and Boz stood up for me and helped me fight that. So I assure you, we're going to get into some very real questions and issues in today's event. But first, Boz, please introduce yourself. Tell us about your background and your experience and why this issue is so close to your heart.
Yeah, Carson, thank you for inviting me here. I appreciate it. If it's just that you and I get to hang out and talk for a bit, I'm appreciative of that. So again, thank you for thinking of me, and it's great to be here. Yeah, I guess my background really was I grew up in a fairly conservative evangelical family. My grandfather was Billy Graham, not a fundamentalist family by any means, but definitely, conservative. Grew up in evangelical churches, and by and large, my experience in church growing up was fine. I didn't have any, I don't think, other than sermons that will go way too long, which evangelicals, because I think pastors, some of them like to hear themselves talk. Other than that, there wasn't a lot of any really that I can recall any type of church trauma that I experienced. And so there are parts of me that love the church. I wasn't overly involved. I think I went to youth group maybe once or twice, but it wasn't a bad experience. And then I ultimately became a prosecutor up here in Central Florida. And Carson, one of the things that I saw over and over again in my sex abuse cases, and ultimately what ended up happening is I helped start a sexual crimes unit, and I was the division chief for that. And so, at any given time, we were prosecuting thousands of both child and adult sexual assault, sexual abuse cases. And, as a somewhat naive person, I started handling these cases, and it just struck me that there were so many of them that were connected to a church. Either the abuse had occurred at a church, or the abuse occurred outside the church, but the victim and their family were part of a church, and they would bring the issue to the attention of church leaders. And almost without exception, this was back in the late 90s, the church just failed over and over and over again. And I was dealing with, as a prosecutor, these victims and their families who were not only trying to cope and survive the underlying abuse that took place, which it was incredibly traumatic and lifelong and processing and dealing with, and on so many levels, on so many people within a family, especially the victim. They were also trying to deal with the church and many of them thought that the church was going to be their greatest advocate, their safe space, and they learned the really deeply painful way that wasn't the case. And so I remember just thinking, man, that's not been my experience in the church. And I thought the church was supposed to be a refuge. I thought the church was supposed to be a safe place. I thought the church, after Jesus, the things he said about children, I mean, my goodness, it should be, we talk so much and put so much emphasis on youth ministry and all of that. Like, why in the world isn't this the safest spot in the world for vulnerable people? And when people get hurt, why isn't the church the greatest advocate for the wounded? And again, I look back and I was naive, sadly. I guess that shouldn't have been naivete, because I think it should have been the case. But, and so when I left the prosecutor's office, I remember thinking, like, what do I do with everything that I've learned on the front lines of dealing with these cases? When you prosecute hundreds of these cases, you learn a lot. You learn a lot about offenders, you learn a lot about church institutions and cultures, and this goes on and on and on. And I thought, man, if there's only a way that I could take what I learned and harness it in some fashion to assist the church, so we don't have as many stories coming out like I was hearing as a prosecutor. Maybe churches just don't know. And so in 2004, long story short, 2004, I helped start GRACE, which stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. And I didn't know what we were going to do. I just knew that, man, if I could bring together a group of multidisciplined experts who are Christians and who are experts in this field in some capacity, maybe, just maybe, we can help train and equip the church to become a different place as it relates to this issue. And so we met in a cramped back office of Dr. Diane Langberg's in the summer of 2004. I'll never forget it, because as I was having our first board meetings, a hurricane was hitting here at home. So I'm talking to my wife, trying to get GRACE started, and a hurricane was hitting here. I probably shouldn't laugh, but everything was fine. But we didn't know exactly what we were going to do. We just wanted to get the word out. It's not like churches were knocking down our doors or asking us questions. In fact, most churches, quite frankly, in the Protestant world didn't think it was a Protestant problem. They were all pointing to the Catholic Church.
Right.
And I remember thinking to myself, based upon my own experience as a prosecutor, I remember thinking, man, this is no less in the Protestant world. People are really either naive or choosing not to believe what I've seen just as a prosecutor. And back in the early 2000s was also when the horrors surfaced in Boston with regard to the Catholic Church. And so there was a lot of focus on the Catholic Church, as there should have been. But I think what that did in many ways is in many Protestants' mind, it sort of gave them a pass, and let's just focus on the Catholics. And that was unfortunate, because I think that in many ways the Protestant world's about 10 years behind the Catholic Church in understanding and addressing these issues. And the Catholic Church still has a long way to go. And so we started, and again, I won't go into the whole story, but probably about 2008 is when things really shifted for us. We got a call from New Tribes Mission, which was a large missions organization. They sort of pride themselves, and they've since changed their names, which that's a whole other story. But they pride themselves in going to like the mission fields where nobody else wants to go, sort of like the Raiders of the Lost Ark of missionaries. I mean, they go to New Guinea and deep in the Amazon. And anyway, they had a boarding school in Africa and Senegal, and they had a boarding school that they operated. And they had missionaries who were the teachers and the dorm parents, and they required missionaries who were over in Africa to send their kids at a certain age to this boarding school. And by the time they contacted us, the boarding school had since closed. But a lot of these missionary kids were now adults, and they were really ticked off because many of them had been sexually victimized while at this boarding school, mostly by other missionaries. And the missionary organization had been aware of it earlier. They didn't really deal with it. Now these people are older. They're ticked off. They want something to be done. And so New Tribes came to us and said, hey, would you all consider investigating this, conducting sort of independent assessment or investigation on what happened here? Carson, that was not even on our radar screen when we started GRACE. I just hadn't thought about it. We just wanted to go go to conferences and teach and do equipping churches and write articles and things like that. But when they approached us with this, I remember thinking, man, I was a prosecutor. I investigated hundreds of these types of cases. We've got other prosecutors on the board. We've got Dr. Diane Langberg, who's an expert when it comes to trauma, and especially within the faith community. So, long story short, we said, yes, we will do it. We were naive because we said our board will do it.
Oh, wow.
If you've ever, most boards are there to, meet a couple times a year. This board we've got the best board in the world. But they said, hey, we're all going to jump in. And the only conditions that we made were with New Tribes is we said it has to be independent, which means that we have to have complete freedom on what we do, who we interview, what we write in the report. And the final report will go to not only you all, but it will also go to these survivors who have met with us. So we're not giving it to you, letting you sort of decide what gets released and what doesn't, like we see all the time. Sometimes reports don't even get released. and we're going to give it to them at the same time. And so that's what we did. It took about a year and a half. Diane Langberg said, and I think she said it correctly, she said, I think each of us left a little bit of our soul behind in that investigation. I experienced and saw things that I had never even imagined. I was deeply troubled. I'm sitting in rooms with kids, they were in their 20s by then. They had no choice to go on the mission field. Their parents went, and they took them. And then these kids are dropped into a boarding school in Senegal, West Africa, which at the time was going through a civil war. So it wasn't just the trauma of physical and sexual abuse. But one of the things that we learned in this investigation that really nobody had talked about was the trauma inflicted on these kids being put in a war zone.
Wow.
And when they finally said something about it, the institution and all too often even their parents just minimized it, and they're really angry. And it was so many of them had walked away from God, understandably so. I remember one weeping in our office when we were interviewing and said, I so much want to have a relationship with God, but I can't. And it struck me as it relates to grace. I remember when we turned in our report, I remember thinking, I looked at the team and I said, we're never going to get asked to do this again. Because we were very direct. You could still see our report on the Grace website. It was pretty harsh. And ultimately, New Tribes, initially they welcomed it. And then the more they realized that they were now becoming the pariah of missionary organizations, because organizations were going, why in the world did you have Grace come in and do this? They didn't say anything nice about you. They just uncovered all this stuff. And then they start saying, yeah, why didn't you guys say some good things about us? I said, well, that's not what we were hired to do. We were hired to go and find truth. And I said, we're just never going to, nobody's ever going to ask us to do this again. And okay, that's fine.
Right.
Well, again, long story short, we ended up doing more and more and more after that. The biggest one probably to date, I think, would be the Bob Jones University independent investigation that we did. And really currently now, that's a good part of the work that Grace does, is independent assessments and investigations on when people come forward and report abuse, especially abuse that occurred maybe 5-10 years ago. The church has, you got to report it to the authorities, and the authorities will focus primarily on the offender. So let's say it's a youth pastor. The authorities are going to investigate and determine whether or not this youth pastor needs to be prosecuted and whether this youth pastor will ultimately end up in prison. But what doesn't happen in a criminal investigation is the assessing of the institution. Like, who knew what, when, where, what did they do about it? That usually doesn't get really examined during a criminal investigation because they're so focused on the perpetrator. And so that's what these investigations have really turned out to become is we have to address the underlying abuse, but a big focus of most of these assessments and investigations are what did the institution do about this? How did they fail to protect? What did they do once they learned about it? And then the goal is to write recommendations so that they can, recommendations that deal with the past. How do they demonstrate genuine repentance to the very people that were hurt, that they had responsibility over? Recommendations for the present. Should they create a fund or some type of monetary fund to help survivors as they look for counseling and things like that? And then recommendations for the future. What do you do to change your institution? What do you do to change the very DNA of who you are so this type of stuff doesn't happen? And when it does, you actually respond in a way that embraces and empowers the survivor and not chases them out the door.
Right.
Anyway, I've gone on and on, but that's so that I did that until 2020, until when I stepped down from being the executive director to do what I'm doing now, which was to really made the determination that I should be using my law degree. I should use my law degree to represent survivors and advocate for them. And there are a lot of good lawyers that do it, and there are a lot of lawyers who shouldn't be doing it. And so I really, after a lot of prayer and thought, decided I should take what I've learned, both as a prosecutor, as the executive director of Grace, and as a lawyer, and do what I can to advocate for these folks as they seek some type of accountability against both institutions and perpetrators.
Well, Boz, I mean, I think you would be one of the most qualified people then to help us. For those who are watching and they're a pastor or an elder or in some form of church leadership, and they would like to prepare their church to not need to bring in grace,
Right.
you know, what would you say are the big buckets of blind spots and problems that you've seen in your professional career, investigating so many different institutions and organizations and churches and representing survivors? What are the big roadblocks that you find, okay, this is common to a lot of different places?
Yeah. Well, let me start really on a macro level. And I think two characteristics that I see in faith communities that pretty consistently that oftentimes contribute and exist in these types of environments, and also prevent churches from doing what they need to do to shift their culture, to make it a culture of safety and protection. One is what's really the combination, and I think Diane Langberg said this one time, and it's so true. It's really the combination of ignorance and arrogance. And so when you have church leadership and let me start with arrogance. When you have church leadership that is arrogant, and when I mean arrogant, that is, we all know the evangelical world. I've sat on 2 different sessions, okay? I'm not saying that sessions are sitting there actually verbalizing that they know better than everybody else. No, there are leaders that do that. But there's this sense when you're in church leadership that you have most of the answers, and that we don't look to the outside for answers, because so much of evangelicalism, in my opinion, is based on this dualistic view of the world, us versus them. And we would not ask them for advice, because we, as us, are the best equipped to address whatever issue it is in our community. And so this arrogance of thinking that pastors, even if they've been to seminary, who've never had a course or training on these types of issues, that they would be best equipped to know how to protect vulnerable people in their community or how to respond, is incredibly arrogant. You know, I've had situations where pastors or people on staff of a church are conducting their own interviews, and I'm like, excuse me, like, tell me your qualifications, like,
Right.
for interviewing a reported abuse victim. Like, what's your qualification? And they'll use some pious, ridiculous answer, but they don't have an answer because they shouldn't be doing it. But it stems from that arrogance, and then you couple that with an ignorance of the issue. You couple that with, because arrogance, oftentimes what arrogance does is it keeps you from wanting to learn. Most arrogant people are not teachable people because they don't feel like they need to be taught in a particular. So when it comes to this type of issue, if I'm arrogant, I don't need to be I'm not teachable. Therefore, I I'm not even reading books on this topic. I'm
Right.
not even trying to learn. I'm not watching videos on this topic and trying to, that at least I could say if you're arrogant but not ignorant, that's at least a start. But no, the arrogance fuels the ignorance. And so because of that, you end up being in these, oftentimes have these church cultures where they're oftentimes dominated by male leadership. To be honest with you, my experience is that though things are said differently, I often find in these environments that females and children are quite frankly just viewed with less value. Now, they would never say that, but you watch over time how men are valued and treated in those communities versus women and children, and you will come to that conclusion in many, many of our churches today. And so and that creates a serious problem as it relates to this issue, because at one point in time, like if a woman said, we saw this in our investigations, most women aren't stepping forward because they don't even feel like anybody will listen. Oftentimes they're trying to convince themselves that what's been done to them maybe is not so bad, because that's the way they're trained to think in some of these cultures. And then when they do step forward, the very few that do step forward are so often marginalized. And if they keep stepping forward and saying, well, wait a minute, I don't think you're listening. Now you're creating dissension, and you're stirring up dissension. And then when you feel bad, when you're feeling frustrated that nobody's really listening, and you go and talk to somebody in the church about it, a friend about it, now you're gossiping. And so pretty soon, the victim, and you see this with kids too, it's just that fewer kids come forward, that the victim now is seen as almost the villainization of the victim. The victim who should have been embraced, believed, and advocated for is now the problem. And so oftentimes those victims, one of two things happens. They either get back in line, told to get back in line and be quiet. And so oftentimes abuse survivors do that because community is so important. And so oftentimes that's the other part of the problem with the modern church today is all of our community is in church. And so losing that is huge. And so they'll get back in line, and then there are some that just are shown the door or walk out on their own. And kids the same way. I mean, fewer kids come forward. But, the old adage, even in my house, I heard kids are, and we had 7 kids, so maybe I have some sympathy for my mom, but, kids are to be seen and not heard. When you think about that, I mean, that in essence, it's sort of funny, but it's in essence is saying, yeah, you're in the back seat, sitting, you guys take a back seat to the adults, and that's a problem. That's a systemic problem, and we may go, well, that makes sense, and you go start looking at this issue, and you go, no, that's one of the big problems, is that the women and the children who have less valued as less are not listened to, and when they try to push, they get vilified. And then the last thing I'll say is, male victims in those environments that are absolutely petrified of coming forward. And I think to this day, I have not researched this, but I think the largest demographic of silent survivors are men and boys. And there are lots of reasons for that, but my own 2 cents is that especially within the Protestant evangelical church, there's this profound fear of being labeled either as if you were molested, then you're going to become a molester. Mm-hmm. Or if you were molested, then you were gay, and you all know what we think about gay people. Or you're emasculated. You're not a godly masculine person, because what masculine person would allow this to happen to themselves? And so those are the fears. Now, it doesn't always happen when somebody comes forward, but those are legitimate fears of male survivors, especially inside the church. So going back to your initial question, I mean, the arrogance plus the ignorance of church leadership in my opinion, fuels a very dangerous and abusive system in which perpetrators are oftentimes empowered and victims and survivors are silenced and traumatized even more.
Now, Buzz, I think everyone who's listening has just got a very heavy heart right now. And I want to ask if there's a corollary to this, which is often the abuser has groomed the church to see him or her as a trustworthy, needed, important leader. And this person will also add to that blame campaign against their victim. And that person's word is taken to be so weighty that it's not challenged or second-guessed. And the abuser is able to leverage their influence in the faith community to re-traumatize their victim and maintain their access for future predation.
Yeah, that's very common. I mean, I just came back from on a case where I can't go into the big details, but here's something I found, and I see this often, is you had a church leader who was very influential, very controlling, learn about a predator in their church, a young predator who had abused a number of young people, kids, children in the church. And part of what this leader did was to go to the parents of some of the reported victims and convince them, and now think about this is your pastor coming to you, convince them that he will deal with it, he's dealing with it, we can take care of this, we're going to keep a better eye on this particular person, we pray about it, and this is the right thing to do. And there were some of those families, Carson, that bought into that. And sadly, because he did that, that offender was given free ride to keep offending, which is exactly what he did. And so, yeah, I think we see a lot of that. It's not just, because I want to get this straight too, I'm not just talking about clergy or youth pastors who are offenders. I mean, those exist, but I think sometimes when we talk about, abuse in the church, that's where people go. And that does exist. I've had plenty of those types of situations, but I'm just talking about inside the church community. The offender, you're exactly right. They groom not just the child or the vulnerable person, but they groom the rest of the community. They want to become, like we had a discussion last week on the grace conversations about trust versus trustworthiness. And one of the dangers is, we talked about the importance of being trustworthy. But one of the dangers of these perpetrators is they know that. And so they spend time grooming so that the church, not only this child or this victim, trusts them, but so does the church. So that when something does come out, people gravitate, Carson, to the narratives that are most comfortable. So tell me what narrative is more comfortable for most people to gravitate towards. That, Mr. Smith, the one that we know and love in this church, who's trustworthy, would have done this to this child, or the narrative of maybe this child is mistaken, or this child comes from a broken home, they're confused, maybe they're looking for attention, and we need to have sympathy for this child, but certainly it's not because this person committed this act. That happens over and over and over again. And oftentimes it's because they've been very intentional about their grooming. I mean, I ask people oftentimes, like, it's funny, not funny, it's tragic how a church, if somebody comes forward and says that the custodian sexually abused me, I find a lot of churches that will respond very well, like harsh, get him out, report the police, because he's the custodian. But what happens when it's the youth pastor? The person that everybody knows and loves? The response oftentimes, more often than not, is so much different. And that double standard destroys lives and it
Right.
empowers offenders. And so that comes back to that whole issue of ignorance and arrogance. Like, how do we equip and educate? How do we develop teachable and humble leaders? And then how do we educate and equip those people to not just leadership, but equipping the entire church community, the whole entire faith community? I remember there was a big church one time that said, we just want our leaders trained. We don't need training for anybody else. And I said, that doesn't work. What you're wanting to do is you're wanting me to give you all information that will give you more power, and you're less power to your congregation. No, your congregation needs to be empowered on this as much as you do. So it's everybody or it's nobody. And I think that becomes really important when we talk about practical steps.
Let's turn to that, Boz. And again, I don't want anyone watching to think that in the past 30 minutes they have figured out all the red flags and problems. We just tiptoed into a couple of issues.
Still figuring them out.
This was 101, and it was a few minutes of it. But Boz, just paint a picture for us of what would a church look like if it was safe and it was well educated and it was empowered. What would be some of the signs of a church that was taking this issue seriously and was prepared to really be compassionate and protective of survivors and be firm and take the right actions towards abusers?
Well, I think transparency is really important. If you've had a church that has had any of this type of abuse in its history, instead of covering it up, being transparent about it, understanding the gravity and grievous nature of this abuse, and grieving over it. Like a church, I would love to hear a leader to say, if it takes us shutting down the doors of this church to address this the way it needs to be addressed, and to demonstrate the genuine repentance that we need to demonstrate, so be it. I'm willing to let go. And that's, to me, is really significant part of a healthy church DNA in a lot of areas, but that is our church leaders transparent, and because of that transparency, it may not look so great, but do they have the willingness to let go? Can they give up some authority? Can they give up some power within that church? How do they have the power and authority distributed at the church? Is it distributed in one person? Is it distributed within 4 or 5 men? Those are, to me, fundamentals. Now, this gets into a whole other conversation we'll probably have another day. I'm just convinced that the current setup that we have in the American and probably the Western church needs to completely, and people hate this term, but I'm going to use it, deconstructed, because that's what I really mean, deconstructed, and we need to begin to reconstruct, because it's just not working in so many ways. I mean, why in the world is abuse within churches, why does it seem to be an epidemic? And something tells me that part of it is because the way we do church, the way we've constructed church, and a lot of really bad theology. But I think it's being transparent. One of the telltale signs I tell people, just to test, if you're looking at churches and you want to try to just even begin to determine, because sometimes you don't know until you get into a church that, oh my goodness, I have some red flags here. But ask the church if they don't have their for example, if they don't have their child protection policy on their website. Ask them for a copy. And if they say they don't have one, ask them why. And if they become defensive, leave. Don't go back. If they say, you know what, we've been meaning to get around to it, but we haven't, it should be a concern to you. But if you say, well, is there something I could do to help make that happen? And they said, yes, we would love that. That's a good sign.
Right.
But how many times I hear from people who ask about the policy and the question is treated almost as an attack. Like, what do you mean the policy? Or yeah, of course we have one. Well, can I see it? Who developed it? When was it developed? Do you look at the policy and review the policy on a regular basis? Do you have outside experts that help you review your policy? I mean, those are like basic questions. But how many church leaders get irritated when people ask certain similar types of questions? That's a telltale sign that that's not probably a place you want to be at. What a healthy church would say is that protecting children and vulnerable people, and I keep saying vulnerable people, there's a lot to be in that category, but I just want to say this. I have seen so many cases in my law practice, and it seems like a growing number, maybe it's not, of what I call adult clergy abuse. And that is where we have, and the Ravi Zacharias is a prime example. Bill Hybels, another prime example. I could go on and on and on about that. Whereas you have a leader in the church, oftentimes the pastor, not always, or a leader in a Christian organization who's sort of the superstar, because that's what we do in the church, and they begin to groom an adult. They find out who the vulnerable, usually it's a woman, who's the vulnerable woman or women in their church. They begin to pay attention to them. They groom them. They create, again, doing everything they can to become trustworthy. And they ultimately end up sharing their own vulnerabilities with this woman. That person then feels empowered to, wow, I can't believe this, my pastor is opening up and he's a real person. And so then their walls come down and they begin to share. And that's how the abuse begins. And there are so many cases of adult clergy abuse. And so when I say vulnerable people, I that's also what I mean, as well as what I'm experiencing in my practice is mostly, not always, mostly women who are in vulnerable parts of seasons of their life, either oftentimes divorced, struggling in their marriage, just having a difficult time. We all go through difficult seasons of life, and a person in authority and power at the church latching onto that and using that as the fuel to groom that person and ultimately sexually violate them. And the sad thing is, in most states, not all, in most states, that's not even a crime, let alone something you can sue a church for. And so when I talk about children or vulnerable people, I just wanted to clarify that that's another demographic of victims that I'm encountering quite a bit. But I think trying to ask yourself, is protecting children, is protecting vulnerable people part of the very DNA of the church that I'm a part of? And what I mean by that is, and sometimes you don't get this right away, but is this just a check the box? Like, hey, we got a child protection policy, so be happy. We did this online training and here we go. Or is it built in? Like, is it who you are as a church? I remember there's a friend of mine, Rob Hoskins, who runs an organization called One Hope down in Fort Lauderdale, and they minister to kids around the world. And I remember speaking to them years ago, and I always appreciate what Rob said afterwards in tears. He said, if we are not the greatest advocates and protectors of children, then we need to shut our doors, because that is who we are. And I'm afraid that too many faith communities and too many churches, that's not who we are anymore.
So I think some of the indicators you've said is that there is just a passion for this protection and this care, that if you ask questions, you get openness and non-defensiveness. It's a humble posture. It's a learning posture. You see authority distributed in the church. You see women valued. You see children respected and treated with value. You see transparency. And I think perhaps the inverse of what I'm hearing you say is you don't see everything image managed, but you see a commitment to truth telling and a practice of appropriate vulnerability. And the leaders are modeling sacrifice. They're modeling service. And those would be a few of the dimensions that we should all be wanting and expecting at a church where we're committing to following Jesus. Yeah,
I agree. I agree with all of that. I think that other thing I would add is, and I touched on this earlier, is the need for leaders, and I think this partly comes with that attitude, is looking to others on the outside for help and knowledge. You know, grace comes in, and we're you know, a Christian organization. I don't like us calling ourselves a ministry, but we're a Christian organization, and so churches and faith communities, I think, feel safer bringing us in, but it doesn't have to be. And again, we have this dualistic worldview in the church, and why would we bring in, you know, and we I will say we do experience this when, you know, for example, you have a very, you know, let's say very conservative church or denomination who might go, well, here's some things Boz has said, or some other people at the organization have said that we don't think we don't agree with theologically, so we can't have them come in. Like, you know, that's this notion of us versus them, and we're not asking them for help. But it's interesting because I guarantee every one of those church leaders, if they had a massive heart attack, they wouldn't be asking that question of the ER doctor.
Right.
And you know what? In many ways, this is no less serious.
Yeah. So, Boz, let's say someone's watching this and they're a pastor, they're a church leader, they're an elder, they have some kind of responsibility in a local church, and they've made it this far, and you know, you're listening right now and you're realizing I have been ignorant and arrogant about this, and you're the kind of person who's willing to make changes and start to address that. And so, Boz, they're open to hearing from you. What would be some immediate next steps they might want to start taking today, this week, to begin to move away from the ignorance and the arrogance, reach outside of their faith community, and begin to make their church a safe space? What's the starting point for someone?
Yeah, starting point. I mean, I don't know if there's a specific right or wrong starting point, but a starting point would say, start reading, start educating yourself. I mean, you're gonna move into asking others to help educate. But as far as today, start educating yourself about this issue. There's different ways you can do that. You know, I think, and again, there's many other resources, but you know, one of the things we try to do on the Grace website is we have lots of different articles that we have intentionally put for people who don't know much but who want to learn. Just start there. You'll get references at that website that will point to books that you can read. But there are other websites as well, and there are other resources as well. I mean, I co-authored a book a few years ago with a good friend of mine who's an Orthodox Jew, Shira Berkovitz, and it's the Child Safeguarding Policy Guide for churches. And you know, again, the last thing, I hate self-promotion. So I don't want to sound this way because I can't stand that. But I'm saying as a resource, like that's a book that we wrote intentionally, Shira and I wrote intentionally for people who don't know much about the issue, but who want to start making incremental changes and then significant changes in their particular community on policies. You know, you can't, even if the more somebody reads about this and educates themselves, they'll realize that you can't just cut and paste a policy from the internet.
Right.
That's not what we do, because that's a shallow check the box culture. And that goes back to what you said, is sort of the showcase mentality. We got our policy. But start reading on this topic. And then once you get to that point and you become a little bit more familiar, I think a church leader, let's say it's the pastor, start bringing in your other leadership on this topic. Don't do this alone. But I will say, whether this is right or wrong, we could debate about it. But the reality is this, that in most churches, the pastor paves the way and the rest of the leadership and congregation often follow. So you are paving the way as the pastor. So you can set the tone for this. You can set the tone for your leaders. You can set the tone for the rest of the congregation to say this is hugely important and we've neglected it for way too long. I've begun to read some stuff. Here's a website I've been reading. There's some helpful articles, but we have to do much more. And that means we have to bring in, because we can't do this ourselves, we need to bring in an outsider that can help us transition our DNA to become a community of protection for vulnerable people and children. And that's, again, there are many organizations that do this. I am on the board of Grace. I'm sure, I think that Grace is the best one. I'm no qualms in saying that. But one of the things Grace does is our safeguarding initiative, where a church will engage with Grace. We send a safeguarding specialist. We connect a safeguarding specialist with that church, and they walk through an entire process that oftentimes lasts months, involving at least one, sometimes two on-site visits. At least pre-COVID, we did that. And we are walking through a process that is ultimately educating and equipping every demographic within that church, from pastors to leaders to adult congregation members to the youth of that church, on these issues. And at the same time, while that is going on, the safeguarding specialist is also working with a group of people from the church, not just leaders, people who want to volunteer to do this, in helping them develop their child safeguarding policies. So that when at the end of the process, not only has the whole church been educated, and they will have in place how do they continue educating, even for new people come in place. We help them to do that. But then it's not just educating, but it's developing their own policy that they can take ownership over, that they can say, listen, we spent months developing this policy. So if you ask me anything about what's in this policy, I can answer you. I can tell you why it's there. You can't do that when you just download something, and there's plenty of policies you can download from the internet. But to me, that is not creating a culture of protection. That is, again, like I said, sort of checking the box, sort of looking from the outside, looking in, going, hey, they've got a protection policy. That's not what I mean when I say making child protection and safeguarding part of the very DNA of who you are as a community. So when you do that, and I just say the last thing is, once you go through a process like that, don't look at it as the end. Don't go, finally finished the Grace safeguarding initiative. Thank goodness. Let's move on to other more happy ministry things. It's actually the beginning. You're actually at the beginning. You have now been recalibrated. It is now becoming part of the DNA of your church, but that's only going to continue if you continue to make that a priority. And that primarily, Carson, has to come from leadership. Very seldom do you, even though I think it should be this way, very seldom do you see things going from the bottom up with this issue. It's usually top down. And so I would say to your pastors listening, recognize how tremendously, how this goes to the very core of who we are as Christians. And spend time just reading the verses of Jesus speaking about children. I can't think of another grouping of people in Scripture that Jesus expressed as much love and care for and value as children. And he was always moving to the wounded and the vulnerable people. That's who we have to be as a church. So, and there are people that want to help you get there.
Yeah.
And your congregation is looking to you to move in that direction. And you know what? It's not always easy. It can be very difficult at times, but it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and Boz, my heart is being moved by you in so many ways during this conversation. But I just want to invite a pastor who might be listening to this conversation to attempt, in the empathy that many pastors have, to imagine a survivor who's in the congregation listening to their sermon week after week, who is struggling to believe in God and is thinking of leaving the church permanently because of the abuse they've experienced at church and the way the church has failed to respond to that. And if we can pray for that person and consider, what does God want for that brother or sister in Christ, for that child, let's do what God would have us do to love that person. And I think that might be a place where a pastor could start to say, this is going to become part of the DNA, part of the culture. It's going to be our identity. And this is going to be something for the rest of the life of this church here. So again, we're just getting started.
I'll give
here.
you a quick,
Go ahead.
Let me give you a quick story on that, because I want to encourage your pastors who are listening to this. I don't want I would hate for them to leave this going, oh my goodness, it's awful. It's the worst
Right.
hour and a half
Absolutely.
of my life. I remember not long ago hearing from an associate pastor at a church. And he said, I had a woman come up to us after church one day. She was a member of the church and she said she had to share something. She and her husband came up and they wanted to share something with me and another pastor. She proceeded to share with them that when she was in high school, she had been sexually victimized by a youth pastor at another church. And she was still struggling with that trauma. And what really triggered her recently was to learn that that youth pastor was now an assistant pastor at a church in a neighboring state. And she didn't know what to do. Well, let me tell you what that pastor did. Within a few weeks, he and another member in leadership got on a plane. They flew to that neighboring state. They had a meeting with the senior pastor at the church where this person was the associate pastor. They disclosed what had happened. They said that person should never be shouldn't be a pastor at all, and should never be around children, and said, what are you going to do about it? And ultimately, that the perpetrator was terminated. Now, and again, it's hard to follow that person all around. He might be in another church today. I don't know. But I can tell you this. He goes, when we got back from our trip, I'll never forget after church, that woman and her husband, he said she literally ran across the sanctuary and hugged us in tears. That is, to me, a beautiful picture of the pastor being an advocate, like the person who would say, you know what, I got a million things going on. Do I have time to get on a plane and fly and have this confrontational meeting with, these people? I mean, it didn't matter to him because he was doing the right thing. And so for her, I cannot even begin to imagine. I mean, just that last scene of her running across and hugging, but what that did with her moving forward in healing from her trauma, what she was seeing this church as now, instead of a source of great trauma, it was a source of advocacy and love for her and compassion for her and her husband. I just remember hearing that going, man, if all of our churches were like, if our leaders responded in ways that ultimately the survivor is running towards the church because they have loved how the church has embraced and advocated for them and valued them, instead of running away from the church. Because I can tell you, and I'm sure your listeners would resonate with this, at least many of them, so many of the people I've met, including probably 95% of my current clients, are people who were either sexually abused by somebody in the church or whose children were sexually abused by somebody in the church. And 95% of them, when they finally get enough courage to report and disclose that abuse to the church leadership, 95% of them, within weeks, sometimes months, find themselves outside of church fellowship.
Gosh.
Now, how does that make sense? Like, these are not the perpetrator. This is the victim and the victim's family. They find themselves outside of church fellowship, to the point where I had one client say, I was in Target a couple weeks ago, a woman that I had known for years in the church. They loved their church until they learned their child had been sexually victimized. She goes, I knew this woman. We went to Bible study together, all these things. She caught my eye. She literally turned around and walked the other way. And I thought, man, that's the direct polar opposite of the example I just gave you a few minutes ago. And so as pastors, let that first story encourage you and motivate you and drive you towards loving and protecting and advocating for survivors, and let the last thing I shared you repel you to say, we don't ever want to create a culture and community like that.
And again, in a 500-person church, almost 100 of them are survivors of sexual abuse. And so this is an issue affecting a huge percentage of your church, and the families of those survivors would extend the percentage up even higher. And so this is a very significant issue as a matter of pastoral care. Now, Boz, just to speak to people who want to come alongside the survivor, a lot of us don't have any idea what the difference is between criminal action and civil action. So as we look to help survivors, what is the difference and what options do they have available as they begin to pursue accountability for their perpetrator?
Yeah, good question. I'll put my lawyer hat on now. So a lot of times people don't understand, and it makes sense for non-lawyers not to really understand the difference between criminal and civil. So let me give you a real quick summary. Criminal is where somebody commits a crime, and the crime is basically against society, against the state, against the government. And so it's the government that holds that person accountable for violating that crime. And so if you have a sexual predator who commits a crime and it's reported, the government, for example, I'm in Florida, the state of Florida will be the state of Florida versus such and such person. And the victim in the case is not a party to the case. The victim in that criminal case is a witness, the primary witness to the case, but they're not a party, which means, this is one of the struggles that a lot of people have with criminal cases, is that the victim doesn't ultimately make the decision on whether a case gets prosecuted and how it gets prosecuted, because the government, the state does. And the ultimate outcome of, and like I said earlier, the focus of a criminal case is the perpetrator. I think, even as a civil attorney who used to be a prosecutor, I think that is, out of the civil and criminal, I'll talk about civil in a minute, criminal is the most important, because a person who has sexually victimized anyone has committed a very serious crime in all 50 states of this country. And that person needs to be reported to the authorities. There needs to be an investigation. There needs to be cooperation with the investigation. The church leaders, if it's something that occurred in connection to the church, should be cooperating with local law enforcement, not hiding the ball from them, and working with them. But again, it's that dualistic worldview, us versus them. And why are we going to bring in the secular or liberal law enforcement to come into our church? We're not going to do that. We can handle it in house. Now, fewer and fewer churches think that way, which is a good thing. But that's the criminal, and the ultimate consequence of a criminal investigation could be prosecution, and that person is prosecuted, and if they're found guilty, could be put in prison. They could be put on probation. There's a punishment element to it. On the civil end of things is not the government against a particular person. A civil claim is a private claim between two people or a person and an entity. And that's what I do with my work, is I'm representing sexual abuse survivors. Many of them have brought criminal cases. Some of them haven't. But sexual abuse survivors who say, I want to hold not only the perpetrator, but the institution responsible. And so I'm going to, and based on a particular type of civil claim, which we won't get into all the details of that, they become an actual party to the case. And that can be significant, because what I tell my clients all of the time, Carson, is you are in the driver's seat. Unlike the criminal case, you were not in the driver's seat. But you are in the driver's seat. This is your case. You are empowered now to hold this institution and maybe even to hold the perpetrator accountable. And civilly, what you do is, with the institution, you go, hey, you were in a pretty common claim in these types of cases is negligence, where the institution knew or should have known that this person was a danger, and they had a duty to protect my client and failed in that duty. They can be held liable. And when we mean liable, ultimately the civil system, the only thing it can really offer is compensation. That's how we value liability, and the degree of liability is through compensation. And a lot of clients that first come to me, especially those who come out of the Christian world, and they feel almost guilty asking for money. And they go, well, I just feel bad asking for money. And I go, my goodness, you shouldn't feel, please don't do that. Because how much money have you spent on therapy in the last 10 years? What has this abuse, think about this, what has this abuse done to your life on numerous levels? Now, money is not going to make it all go away. I get that. But compensation is what the system provides. And so you need to be compensated. I had a client just the other day. I love this. She's been through hell. We finally resolved her case. And one of the things I told her to do, I said, listen, take a little bit of that money. Obviously, you're going to use most of it for therapy and move it forward, but do something for yourself. And she just texted me 2 days ago. And so I just want to let you know that I just bought tickets to Hawaii and I'm going in a couple weeks, and I paid it for some of the proceeds from this case. And I'm like, that's awesome. I loved hearing that. I'm like, yes, finally do something for you.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with that. But the civil case will hold institutions responsible. Now, we sometimes sue individuals as well. But at the end of the day, the pragmatic aspect of it is if the only thing the civil system can provide is compensation, then if an individual has an ability to pay, then absolutely. If they don't, sometimes we'll still include them because they need to be held accountable as well. They need to have their deposition taken. They need to go through that process. But more often than not, from the compensation part of it, you're going to get the institution or their insurance carrier, if they have one, to ultimately have to pay out. So that's a sort of a difference. And so I would say for people walking alongside, I'd say first and foremost, you can't force somebody to report and you can't force somebody to file a lawsuit. But what you can do is walk with them, because I think most people, at least my experience is, Carson, is that most survivors don't report to law enforcement, and because they feel isolated, they feel like they're alone in all of this, they feel desperately fearful. And so one of the things we can do is walk alongside them, just presence, the incarnation, just be present. Let them know that they'll never walk alone on this journey. And over time, I've found so many of them, over time, so many survivors will feel empowered to say, okay, I'm ready to report this. I'm now ready to actually hold the church or the organization responsible and hold them accountable through a civil case. But it has to happen in their time. And so when somebody calls me asking about a possible case, I'll share with them the different things that we're talking about now. But I always will let them know, like, this has to be, because this will be your case, it has to happen in your timing. And so if it's not right timing right now, then don't do it. If it is the right timing, then yeah, I can help you with that. But it's really important, more important than anything else, is just to be present. Let them know that they're not doing this alone, because so many survivors, other than maybe a Facebook group here or there, or some, Twitter that they read, are absolutely alone in their everyday life, in their real person life. And we can't let that happen.
So, Boz, I want to come back to that in a second, but, part of what I've needed in my journey is counseling and processing a lot of the spiritual abuse and other painful experiences I had at RZIM. What is it that, as you walk alongside people, how do you help them evaluate a good counselor, a good therapist? How could a pastor or a church leader help a survivor identify a good counselor who has the training to help someone with all the complexities of the aftermath of their abuse?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because my dad was a clinical psychologist, so I feel like I have a little bit of knowledge on this topic. And I remember my dad telling me sometimes he was from Switzerland, so he had an accent which just gave him more of a psychologist. But he would say sometimes, Basile, no counselor is better than a bad counselor, and that there's a lot of truth to that. Just because somebody is a counselor does not mean they're equipped to counsel this type of topic. Just like if somebody knocked on my door right now and said, I need some assistance with tax law, I would look at them and go, why would you come to me? Well, because you're a lawyer. And I would say, just because I'm a lawyer doesn't mean I should be helping you with tax law. It's the same type of thing. And so what we have to do is we do have to understand, and church leaders need to understand, like, how do we ascertain who are people who are well equipped and knowledgeable and experienced to be providing this type of counseling. And more often than not, I start with you look for a trained and experienced, what we call trauma-informed therapist. trauma-informed therapist is somebody who has had specialized training and specialized education on various aspects of trauma and complex trauma, which can be, it's not an easy subject, and it takes a lot of education. Because to me, the trauma therapist is the frontline therapist. And I would say to your pastors, and this is something that we have to get out of our mindset, is if somebody needs a trauma therapist, a survivor comes forward, they've never had therapy before, and they are asking for it. A trauma therapist, more important that you connect them with a good trained trauma therapist than a Christian therapist. It's okay. So going back to my example before, if I have a heart attack, I don't care if the ER doctor is a Christian. I just want him to be really good at treating heart, or my heart surgeon. Maybe even that's even better. I want the heart surgeon, the cardiologist, to be a really good cardiologist. I don't really care at that moment what his views are on Jesus or paedobaptism. Who cares? I just want him. So it's the same thing here. I mean, we got to connect them with that trauma therapy. Now, what I say is, once you connect somebody with an informed trauma-informed therapist, maybe in time, because there are a lot of spiritual questions survivors have. Because I do believe that just about all sexual abuse involves some form of spiritual abuse in some capacity, even if it's outside the church.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of spiritual issues that probably should get addressed, whether they're in the Christian context or outside of that. And there may be a time to connect that survivor in your church with somebody in addition to that trauma therapist that might be able to help address some of those. But even that person has to have some knowledge and education to understand the complex dynamics of abuse.
Yeah.
Because if they don't, they could actually be counterproductive to the very trauma therapy that person is receiving. So who are the trauma therapists in your community? Start off with finding in your congregation. Most congregations have therapists or counselors. Start to asking them, do you know the trauma-informed therapists in our community? What's their reputation? We want to have a short list of individuals that we can connect with, that when somebody comes to us. And I'm just telling you this, Carson, it shouldn't be a short list of pastoral counselors on your church staff.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm talking about. That's like me having a heart attack, but going down to the storefront urgent care to get a Band-Aid.
Yeah.
No, you need to connect. And this has got out, the us versus them conundrum that we often find ourselves dealing with. It's okay if you have a list of 5 trauma-informed therapists that have a good reputation, and 4 of them aren't Christians. Great. You should have a list of 5 still,
Right.
not just 1. And then working with those people in your congregation if they know, and if they don't know, I mean, you can begin researching. I mean, we've got so much at our disposal to begin researching. But I find the best way, just like in most professions, is to get word of mouth, get people's opinions, and oftentimes the best people to provide you those opinions are people in the field. So you might have counselors or therapists in your church who go, I'm not a trauma-informed therapist, but Sally Smith in town is really good.
Yeah.
And then the church could develop relationships with those people, letting them know, hey, we want to let you know, we want you to be a resource for us. We want to send people your way. What if you even had a church that said, listen, for the first X number of sessions, we want to underwrite and pay for that, just to get that going. Now, I think if the church has a responsibility or is in any way responsible for the abuse, that should never be an issue. They should be
Automatic.
paying for that, period.
Yeah.
Automatic. But if somebody comes to you and says, I was sexually victimized when I was a child by my father, what a beautiful picture for not only connecting that person, but saying, we want, for the first 6 months, we want to help. We want to help out, and get you. We don't want money to be an issue, because I have a lot of clients even now, Carson, who say, I really need counseling, Boz, but I just don't have the money. I mean, I'm just barely making ends meet. I might be able to go once every 2 months, but that's not enough. And so healing is a huge part of all of this. healing is a huge part of what the DNA should look like in the church that we're talking about. And so how do we facilitate and encourage and maybe even help underwrite the process for that healing in the people that are in our midst?
Well, and I think that, that's something that is within the paradigm of a lot of churches is we're familiar with benevolence funds, and someone loses their job,
Yep.
They get sick, there's a meal train. There's a lot of ways in which churches have that natural reflex to reach out with compassion to people who have experienced something outside of their control that has diminished their capacity to handle the burdens. We carry one another's burdens. And I think we're just adding to that scope of how we care for one another's burdens. And even, I would say, to the point of picking up the lawyer's fees to say, look, we'll pay for this much to get your civil case going because we want to be part of the accountability process and seeking justice for you. And so, there has to be wisdom and discernment, and not every church has that resource right now. A lot of churches are struggling after COVID and different cross currents in our culture. But as we're able, I think that those are wonderful things. Now, Boz, you mentioned over and over again the us versus them dynamic, which is a critical piece of this whole issue. But sometimes the us, we do want to have that gift of presence that you talked about. What does it look like? What are the do's and the don'ts where we're not being arrogant, we're not overstepping, we're not hurting more than we're helping? But what does it look like for us to be present to someone who's been through something we have no experience of, we have no training for, we don't want to give the simplistic answers, but we don't want to stay away from them because we're afraid of hurting, because we're afraid of getting it wrong. How do we show up and offer that gift of presence in a way that's helpful?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I think you're right. I think there are a lot of people who care, but because they just don't know how to do it or feel like they don't know how to care well, they just sort of keep a distance. And then you've got the other extreme where the people are just always there and the person's like, back off. And so even though both categories of people, I think, have the heart's in the right place. They want to love well and care well. I think being present is important. Being present can mean many different things, and I think, quite frankly, it depends on the person. I oftentimes, what I've learned in my own life is I let the survivor dictate that. They lead in that, and what I mean by that is, I want to be present, and I will check in with those people. I will always be checking in with them. But I also don't want to be, so I'm not just disconnecting, but I also want to be really sensitive to, it's part of all of this is people who've been abused have had so much taken from them. They've had choices taken away from them. They've had power taken away from them. They've had their very lives taken away from them. And so part of presence is what can we do to assist in whatever way we can to help give power back, give back. And so that's what I mean by saying, they should be the leader in this. And that doesn't mean that you're saying, I'm here for you, just let me know. No, but I'm saying that let them define the relationship and talk about that. It's okay to talk about it, but say, listen, I want to be sensitive. I want to be here, and I'm going to be here, and you're going to get a text from me every couple of days, and whether you like it or not, I am going to text you every couple of days and let you know that I'm thinking of it. But I want to be here, but I want you. What does that look like for you? And I think it just depends on the survivor, and it depends on the person too, because so much of this is about the violation of trust. And it's all about betrayal. And so we can't be surprised when we might come up to a survivor we don't know real well and say, hey, I'm here for you. I'm going to be here for you. And they turn around and don't want anything to do with you.
Right.
Because why would they? They anything dealing with relational trust has been decimated because of the trauma they suffered. So sometimes it's just a very long road of becoming, like we talked about earlier, trustworthy. And sometimes people will respond to that much quicker. Sometimes people will take a lot more time. But what I've seen more often than not, though, is if you're present, and again, that presence can take different forms. But if they know you're present and that present is constant or consistent, maybe that's a better term, then that trust oftentimes does develop in some degree. If you try to be present and after about 6 months you give up, they were expecting that. And that's what I see so oftentimes in our churches is even the churches that respond initially well, traumatized people have many issues they're processing, and they're difficult issues. And as a result of that, they can be difficult at times, just like we all can. And so what ends up happening is the church says, man, we've tried for three months, but we got to move on to somebody else because this is just too difficult. Well, you know what? They were expecting that. You got to be in it for the long haul, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, isn't that what Jesus has done with us? Each of us. It's not like I'm so wonderful that like, look how lucky Jesus is to be around me all the time. My goodness, he's walked with me my entire life, good, bad, and ugly. And we have to change our understanding of what it means to be present in the lives of traumatized people in our midst. And part of that is just being consistent and understanding this is a long journey and it's never going to be all perfect. There are going to be days they may yell at you. There are going to be days they could be very difficult. There'll be days you might be difficult, but this is a lifelong journey. And I just think most survivors and duly reasonably understood don't respond right away because they think, you know what, this is not going to last. And because they've experienced it before. And the thing that you can do as a church to demonstrate differently is to make it last.
I think that's a really powerful image of how Jesus has loved us. And one image that's been on my heart this week is of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. And I can't imagine being in that room. I would be enormously uncomfortable. And yet, in a far deeper sense, Jesus has washed my feet in the past. He's washing my feet today. He is one day going to cleanse me completely. And the tenderness and the humility and the constancy of Jesus taking care of my needs, that ought to have some way of shaping me into a servant who's going to show up and not necessarily to wash someone's feet, but to have that humble heart of, I'm here to empower you. Boz, we've got time for...
It's not about, and we have to remember, and I think we all struggle with this, especially in the age we live in, is it's not about us.
Right.
So it's not about me ministering to this survivor. If that's your attitude, if that's the understanding, then you've got it wrong. It's about them. And whether anybody notices that we are doing it, whether we have to, we don't have to publicize it. We don't have to slap ourselves on the shoulder saying, look what we're doing. It's for them. It's about them. And the other thing I'll just say real quickly is when we do that, when we're present, remember, like you said at the beginning, there are so many other survivors in your community, your faith community. Some of them you know, some of them you don't know. But I can tell you one thing, they're watching. They're watching what you're doing. They're watching what you do as it relates to policies. They're watching what you do as it relates to responding to abuse disclosures. They're watching what you do as it relates to walking with survivors, the long road. They're watching that. And how you respond, how you act as a church, as church leaders, as individuals, can make a huge difference to a group of people that you may never ever know about.
Wow.
And because they're watching, and it may even help prompt some of them to feel safe enough to maybe step forward and share their own story. So what other people are we can't forget that it's not the audience. And again, we don't do this just for an audience. But I'm just saying that there are, because of the nature of what you described earlier of how many survivors we have in our communities, that we need to remember that others are watching, and that while we serve here, we hope that we're creating a safe space for the others in our community.
Boz, if I could just ask one last question that's come in. One participant says their church is currently mishandling child sexual abuse. and most of the members are falling for the image management strategies that's diminishing and dismissing and discrediting. And the person watching right now wants to know if there's anything that I believe she can do as a member to help open eyes. So I know we talked about how things are often top down. It sounds like this church has already begun an image management campaign. Is it a hopeless situation? What would be some last efforts to make for someone who's wanting to help out in this situation?
It's pretty hopeless, if I'm being honest. I would say that maybe you're sort of as a lawyer term, a good faith effort by this person would be to have a meeting, not alone, bring somebody with you with leadership and share specifically what your concerns are. If you're going to get one of two general responses in that meeting, either pushback of we know what we're doing and this is why we're doing it, or oh my goodness, you raised some really good points and we're so sorry that we've not thought about them. And then it's still too early at that point. That just might be nice language to appease you, but then you got to see if things change. I would say, though, if you're already in a church where image management has taken the priority over survivor care and truth, you need to leave. I tell people more than once a week. In fact, I told my clients yesterday, I said, just remember, church is not a prison. You can walk out. But so many of us, because so much community is there, with so many relationships are there, leaving is not easy. I get it. But thinking that you're going to make that difference and you're going to help change that, in my 30 plus years of experience, is probably not going to happen. And so you can spend the next year or two fighting it and lose more of your life in this place, or you can say, okay, I've got to step out and find and search for a healthier community. I know you want to make changes, and that's good, but so there's nothing wrong to want to help effectuate change. I'm just saying in 30 plus years, I could probably count on one hand where I've seen it.
Wow. Well, one person adds in this perspective, which I think is helpful, is that you can leave the church, but you don't have to leave the victim. And those are two separate choices, to stay present with the survivor and their family, even as you leave the church. Well, Boz, we've just begun this conversation, and there's a lot of resources you've pointed us to, from Grace to Dr. Diane Langberg. Wade Mullen, Dr. Wade Mullen has been someone who's really helped me understand a lot of these dynamics. And obviously people may want to reach out to you because they've seen your compassion and your expertise in this conversation. And unfortunately, they need your help. And so they can go to BozLaw PA.com and begin that conversation with you there. And I'll have a link to that under the YouTube video. But Boz, thank you for your work. We honor you for the representation you've done and the initiatives you've started. I know my heart is very burdened and sad for this crisis, and I'm thankful that you are helping us learn how to do better. I also want to say, if you've made it this far, you might want to take another step with Uncommon Pursuit. We'll create space for this discussion in our online community. And one of our core values is participation that creates transformation. And the point is that it's helpful to listen to a conversation like this, but sometimes we need a space to talk it out and ask more questions and have more people show us, hey, here's some good resources and ways to approach this. So if that's you, you can learn more at uncommonpursuit.net. And that's also where you can find information on upcoming events. Boz, thank you for your time and your wisdom and your heart. To everyone who's watching.
Thank you, Carson. You've been an inspiration to me, and I can just say one of the things that I have enjoyed the most about the advocacy work that I've done, both with Grace and now as a lawyer representing clients, is I have been so privileged to meet some of the most amazing people in the world, and they've continued to teach me so much. And so you, amongst so many that I have met in this line of work, are a hero. Because you have been through your own stuff, and I know it, and you didn't just say, okay, I'm done with it. You wanting to turn around to empower and help others and educate others is so important. So thank you for doing this, and whatever I can do to help encourage you along the way, please let me know.
Well, thanks, Boz. I will say that the North Star for me has been Lorianne Thompson. And
Yeah.
Well, to everyone who's watched, thank you. Your time is valuable to us. I hope you feel that we've stewarded it well. And I really want to encourage you to not make this the end of your journey. This was a catalyst. It was a starting point. It was a first step or a second step on the road. But please commit to going the rest of this journey and walking along the road with survivors. Thanks for being here today, and that's it.